Hey, this is John. Let's Talk Native is now on Patreon. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. We will be producing exclusive content for our Patreon supporters. Thanks for checking us out.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. We highlight the voices of Native activists, writers, poets, artists, thinkers, and musicians who are fighting for the rights of Indigenous people all over Turtle Island. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. In this moment of historical change and social justice, our voices matter now more than ever before. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Say hello and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I am John Kane, and look, I want to talk about some things today that part of the thing is it's difficult to speak about specific Native issues this time of year, in this time of the U.S. election cycle, and there's just so many things going on. The COVID numbers are going through the roof. Last show or last week, I mentioned by this week, you would see on Friday or Saturday 90,000 cases on a single day. And that happened on a Thursday. So everything is actually going even faster than I predicted as far as COVID-19. The likelihood is by next week, you will see 100,000 cases in a single day. I was always pinging it on a Friday because Fridays have always been the days that the reporting gets the highest. But like I said, this past week, it was on Thursday that 90,000 was hit. So it is getting really bad. It's going to get real worse. Jake and I kick it around. We talk about how the way March was the longest month ever. Well, November is going to be like that. And it may not just be November. It may be into December. And it's crazy. And this goes beyond Native issues. We are impacted by it. In fact, I'm going to try to get Janine Yazzie back on the program because the Navajo numbers are really going through the roof. But I suspect all territories are going through some of the same thing. And it's a little harder to wrap our heads around it because the reporting isn't done specifically on any other Native territory the way it's being done in Navajo territory. But I think that's emblematic of what we're all experiencing. But again, these numbers are terrible, and they're going to get worse. I think anybody who's gotten comfortable with the level of, activity, even socializing, because too many people are just ignoring what's going on. Look, if you go into any place of business, I guarantee you're going to find at least a handful of the employees who may be wearing a mask, but it's down below their nose, which is completely pointless. People aren't being as careful as they were 6 months ago, and it's going to show itself. And on all of these spikes in the daily number of cases that are being confirmed will turn into spikes in deaths. Usually it's 8 to 10 days after somebody's infected. So what we're seeing today in the increased number of cases, by next week, it's going to start to show up in the daily death rate. I mean, as it is, it's pretty consistently turned into 1,000 a day, but they're saying that could be 2,000 a day, or maybe even get up to 3,000 a day by mid to late November and into December. So it is again. with this looming and pandemic that we're in the middle of, and I don't think we're at the end of it, even close to the end of it. It sometimes gets hard to talk about anything else, and but so I wanted to at least spend some time talking about that. And of course, the other thing is next week is the United States election, and it's going to it dominates everything that's on the news, everything on television. Hell, even a lot of the cable movie channels have either series or specials. All of the late night hosts, everything that you may have been used to watching, is all about the election and these candidates that are running. So I got to remind people that it's not our election. No matter how much they tried to suck us into this thing with, get out the native vote and either pandering to us, or in some places, this idea of suppressing the vote, it's not our election. And in fact, I was a guest on a radio show last week, and I was asked about this idea of voter suppression. And I have a completely different view on this thing, because I think that neither the pandering to native people for the vote or the suppression of a vote is about us. It's not about trying to get more native votes or less native votes, because frankly, our numbers are so small, and I've talked about this before, our numbers are so small that anybody who would invest money, in terms of, time, campaign dollars, or even any kind of policy or strategy, anybody who would invest energy into our vote, that's just a poor investment. There are bigger targets for trying to get out the vote or stop the vote. And to waste any time trying to suppress or encourage our vote just seems like a waste of any political capital one way or the other. But here's what I want to say about it. I think the idea of pandering to the native vote is not about us. It's about the main body of politics, right? It's about white people. Hold up a native person and say, "Oh, look, I'm going to give some special treatment to native people. I'm going to do a photo op with them. I'm going to, pass new legislation if I'm elected," or whatever else. That's about trying to endear yourself to the progressive left. It's meaningless, but that's what it's about. So when they try to pander to us, it's really about pandering to their voter base. And the same thing that I will say on the right with suppressing native vote. They don't really care if they knock off a few native voters in North Dakota. We weren't going to change the outcome of the election anyway. But how does that play to their white supremacy base? Well, it plays pretty well. So whether it's voter pandering or voter suppression, neither of those are about the native vote. It's about the base on the right, and it's about the base on the left. And I know this isn't a widely held view on this issue, but if you really if you do the math, it should be obvious that investing any time, energy, or capital into getting out the few native votes that will get out, or suppressing of the few native votes, there are bigger fish to fry for the right and for the left than us. And so I think that has been mischaracterized. So, and again, this kind of reaffirms again that this isn't our election. Even when we get sucked into it for photo ops or whatever, it's not about us. It's about them. It's not our election. It's not our problem. And it's certainly not our solution. Now, I'm not saying the outcome of election doesn't present problems for us. But it presents problems for us either way. We aren't catered to by the Democrats or the Republicans. And to the extent that any of our issues either cross-sect or intersect with the issues of others that are not as marginalized as us, or even to the extent that they overlap, the solutions are not the same. Because for the most part, the vast majority of Native people view themselves as distinct. And now I'm not saying that that we don't get caught into the whole American citizenship or Canadian citizenship thing, but we aren't fighting necessarily for Canadian rights. Look, the whole land back issue in Six Nations, or the fighting over pipelines in Wet'suwet'en, or fishing in Mi'kmaq territory, or any of our opposition to pipelines on this side of that imaginary line, we aren't fighting the same fight. And when we get sucked into their court systems like that's somehow going to help. And look, and even I know we go through that process. Look, even the guys up in Six Nations are utilizing the Canadian court system as one of their multi-pronged strategies. And it ain't going well. I mean, let's face it. You get a judge that says, "Well, we're not even going to take your submissions because you're already in contempt of my court." Well, yeah, we do. We hold your court in contempt, and that's our view of this whole thing. But just like the court systems aren't there for us, this election system isn't there for us. So I think I just want to remind people not to get too caught up in it. Look, you can watch the returns. I mean, it's entertaining television. I get it, and I watch it too. I mean, but I'm not emotionally invested in the outcome of this election. There's a part of me that says, you know what? If Trump gets elected, that's what Americans deserve. And if Biden gets elected, then, look, you're going to get, that doddering old fool as well. So, I mean, the election is not ours. Those are not our candidates. Neither one of those candidates is going to do anything for us directly. But I will say we are going to have to figure out how we deal with the outcomes of the election. And I don't mean immediate outcomes. I mean long-term stuff. But because they are not going to pursue solutions by either from the right or the left that accommodate us. We are still going to have to fight for everything that we've always fought for. So anybody who's like holding out hope that an election is going to change anything, look, this is about electing, the next team of oppressors that we are going to face. And it doesn't matter if we participate or not, because it's still an outcome that is not geared towards us. So I say that because, look, I realize we're still a few days away, and and we have one more show before the election, which will be a special broadcast, by the way. We're not going to do a Tuesday show. I'm going to tell you that right now, because that Tuesday is going to be a crazy day. So we'll do a Monday show, but and I'll talk more about issues related to what will happen post-election. But right now, I'm just saying today we have to really kind of own the situations that we face. And we've got to come up with our solutions. And we certainly should not be hanging any hope that a U.S. election or a court system, U.S. or Canadian, is going to solve it. Like even the battles that are going on in Six Nations again. Even if the court lifts an injunction or whatever else, that doesn't solve the problem. We still represent a significant impediment to the goals and strategies of Canada and the United States. We are not candidates for a piece of the American dream, or whether that American dream is associated with the U.S. or with Canada. No, we aren't. We aren't in the food line for that. We aren't, it's not our game. What the thing is that we have to realize is that whatever is being pursued by the U.S. and Canada, we have to figure out what our strategy is to make sure that their pursuit of their happiness, which is really dollars, doesn't negatively impact our lives. And I know it's tough because it pretty much always does. But I think this is the thing that we have to understand is that we've got to draw the distinction between us and them. And I'm not saying that it's an us and them, battle for mortal combat, I guess. It can get to that. But if we do employ what we basically have been known for, which is our own diplomatic skills, then we can begin to pursue our solutions to the problems caused by them. We can't expect them to offer solutions to the problems that they're causing. I mean, it's just not the way the system has ever worked. And to the extent that they will placate us, and this is another thing that I feel very strongly about. I hear people talk about treaties all the time. I literally saw somebody post on, and it might have even been on the Land Back group page, that we need to return to calling ourselves Indians. And I'm thinking, yeah, what? And they said, yeah, because Indians are the word they used in our treaties. All right. I'm sorry. For one thing, they aren't our treaties. We never asked for a treaty from the US or Canada. They offered these tools of placation, this idea that they were going to, pay lip service to us to buy time so they could pursue their strategy of defrauding us in the long term. There is not a single treaty that the US or Canada ever entered into or negotiated with us that they ever intended to follow. So when I hear people say, well, we've got to call ourselves Indians because if we call ourselves something else, then we've essentially removed ourselves as a party to our own treaties. They aren't our treaties. It's their words. It's in their language. It was their strategy. And look, they were always trying to dupe us. This whole thing is about deceit. Every treaty, every policy, look, when they were trying to remove us from our territories, they told us that we were going to have these great places to move to. Of course that was a lie. Of course it was bullshit. They weren't going to move us to some place that was valuable, that was fertile. And to the extent that they did it because they were moving us to land that was all native land anyway. They were just trying to make us fight each other in those circumstances. I mean, the whole thing is just more fraud heaped upon more fraud. And so when I hear our own people start trying to put major emphasis on treaties, look, there are some Native people who identify themselves as we're a treaty people. What the hell does that even mean? They don't define us. Again, just like I'm saying that this election isn't ours, those documents aren't ours. At best, they created documents where they promised to recognize what already was. They didn't give us any. There's no granting. When I saw somebody list that the Mi'kmaq were granted a right to fish, no, they weren't. They weren't granted a right to do anything. What was recognized by treaty and then ultimately by their courts and their constitution was not that they had a treaty right, but that the treaties that were entered into recognized the right that they already had. This isn't just semantics, folks. This is important. We can't get sucked in to allowing the US or Canada to constantly identify and define us. We have to do it ourselves. We get sucked into the blood quantum game. We get sucked into their their male dominance. Look, we already kind of got sucked into the whole thing that the children carry the father's last name, even though most of us operate in a matrilineal system. So we've already upset that to some extent, and it gets confusing. It gets confusing about following which clan you're from. Your mother's line gets totally disrupted because in the European model, it was all about male lineage, not matrilineage. So we have to, and I'm not saying we should bail on all our last names, so don't people get upset about that. But I'm not suggesting that. But we can't continue down that same path. We have to draw the distinction. So again, when I hear people talk about us being treaty Indians and that we can't call ourselves anything but what was already entered into a treaty, man, I mean, that's giving even more power to the words that were written on a paper that were shoved down our throats, oftentimes with a little bit of gin and rum to go along with it, at a time where our understanding of their words was diminished. I mean, we were not the great masters of the English language when all of these so-called treaties were negotiated. And and then they would also, there was a time where they wouldn't let us see the written words. They would say, well, no, the written words are ours. You just put what we said in a wampum belt and that's yours. Which again is crazy. I mean, if we don't know the words they wrote down, the words that they're saying, how do we represent that in a wampum belt? And of course, then they even screw up that, because then they start commissioning some of our wampum belt makers to make a belt that captures their intent and their character. The George Washington belt, that's not even one of ours. And I've talked about this before. It is complete fraud. And when I hear the Oren Lyonses or the Sid Hills say, well, the George Washington belt is our belt for the Canandaigua Treaty. Oh, for crying out loud. How do we get this screwed up? How do we get into a place where the so-called leaders, the ones who are recognized, even by our own people, the ones that we prop up as iconic individuals, can get history so freaking wrong? So, look, we got to nip some of this stuff in the bud. So let's make sure that we do not get sucked into this idea that we have to identify ourselves with the labels that they imposed on us, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Because we can't. I mean, I'm not crazy about First Nations or Native Americans or any of these other labels either. As far as I'm concerned, we need to spell out who we are, use our language. And whether we use broad language like Ongwe, or whether we use, specific, words like Ganyagahaga or Onondawaga or Haudenosaunee, whatever we're going to use, let us be the ones that define those words. And we have to stop. We have to stop letting them put us in their box. I mean, it's absurd that any Native person is still embracing this word Indian, and so many are. I mean, and I know that some of the old timers, they have a hard time shedding some of that old language, even though their first language is oftentimes our own language. But the command of the English language is still sometimes overwhelmed by some of these words that were imposed upon us. Look, I got to remind people, our identities have been manipulated so badly that our own people, even the so-called chiefs, were donning Plains Indian headdresses in the 40s and the 50s and later. And why was that? Well, because we were getting our own cues about what we were supposed to look like from Hollywood, from literature. And so this whole idea that we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated in this way. And I'll tell you, this last couple of generations were the ones who brought more back. Now we know what a Gostoa is. Now we know what the symbolism is of some of the things that were really truly part of our culture. Not this idea of grabbing some Hollywood image to call it our own. And that goes with the language, with the words that we use, with the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we are as guilty as anybody else in grabbing onto this male dominant culture. I mean, how many times have you heard people refer to, oh yeah, we have a chief's council. We operate under a chief system. Well, we never did before. If we do now, that's just as much assimilation as an elected system. Because we didn't have a chief system. We had a clan system where the women were equal participants. No, they weren't the lords and masters either. Even a clan mother had responsibilities. But they didn't have this ultimate authority. We have lost so much from who we were. And I got to tell you, we lost a lot of this stuff while we still had the language. Well, look, when I look at that Haldeman track, where Six Nations Reserve is that tiny little spot, on that entire Haldeman track, most of that land was lost while our language was still intact. So, I mean, and I'm not saying it to condemn the language. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I oftentimes hear people say, especially the ones who want to say they're so uber traditional, well, the problem is we've lost our language. Well, you know what? We were losing land, we were losing culture, we were losing identity long before our language was lost. In my family, my father, his first language was Mohawk, Gonyogeha. So when I hear people say, the problem is we lost the language. The language was one of the things we held onto the longest. We lost way more land than we lost language during most of that period of time. So our language didn't save us. We saved it. And in fact, it was something that we could hold on to it was easier to hold on to our language than our land. And it was easier to hold on to our language than our culture. Look, I've seen Bibles printed in Mohawk. Yeah. I mean, hymns. My aunt was a devout Catholic. She sang for the Pope. I don't know which one, but one of them anyway. I mean, this is how much, and what she sang were hymns that were done in Mohawk. Gonyogeha. So when I hear people talk about the problem, the reason we've lost so much is because of loss of language. No, they got into our head while our language was still firmly on our lips, was still on our tongue. So I think we have to stop making excuses, and we have to own some of that history, and including some of the history where our own identities were challenged and disrupted, because we still have the language. And in that language, if we take the time, we can learn more about the past, because that language is a key to the past. More so, look, the land and nature teaches us how to live today, if we choose to, or we can be unnatural, capitalists like white people are. But nature is a guide, a continuous guide. But the only thing that gives us an eye or a view of the past is our language. Because even ceremony and, some of the cultural stuff associated with the Longhouse, if we don't dissect the language as we're doing that, we are going to misinterpret it. And I've talked about that a lot on the show. There's so many things that we say today that have already been altered by Christian mentality. The emphasis on creator over creation. The idea that that we've embraced this notion of heaven and the evil versus good construct that is tied to so much a part of Christianity. We've adopted that, and we've actually incorporated it into our stories and into our culture. And we have a hard time backing it back out. And we can do that, especially if the folks who really understand language help, because it's not just enough to be able to say pass the salt in Seneca or Mohawk. We better understand a little bit more at a deeper level. By all means, use whatever you've got, but we have to take more time and put more effort into understanding it deeper. All right, hey, we'll take a break and we'll come back with a little bit more. Again, I want to talk more about what we need to do, not what they need to do, and we'll do more of that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Let me give a shout out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and the folks at Grand River Enterprises. And of course, I want to remind people that we are on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native, you can see that we're there and you can support the program through Patreon. There are lots of ways you can support us, but this is one that we're kind of excited about. We're actually creating some exclusive content for our Patreon members. So again, check us out, and by all means, sign up. You don't have to do much. If we get more, look, we've got a lot of people who check out our videos. We've got a lot of members of our group page on Facebook and that kind of stuff. I realize that not everybody's active, but we get even a fraction of some of those people joining us on Patreon, and it makes a big difference, and it enables us to do more of what we're trying to do here, and produce more content. And it is tough because, look, we don't have a research staff behind us. It's basically just us trying to do something here, and it's a challenge. So we watch the news, we follow the trends, and we try to deliver a native perspective to the issues that affect us all. And specifically, we try to follow what's happening on native territory. So again, check us out on Patreon, support the program. I know some of you occasionally drop a check in the mail or do whatever else, and that always helps. So again, I want to thank you for that. Look, as I said, we are going to have to figure out how we fend for ourselves, regardless of what happens, next week. We have our own challenges in front of us. And I've talked oftentimes about identity. I've talked about us trying to consolidate some of the ideas associated with our identity so we aren't scattered all over the place. One of the things I mentioned before was this idea of unity sounds great, and the idea of us standing in solidarity. But in our culture, the idea of unity is really captured in the idea of bringing our minds together, our minds as one, putting our minds together as one. That's where the unity comes. So it comes from the thought. So if we can't agree on basic things like what the hell to call ourselves, it makes it a little tough to stand arm in arm. So, and I'm not saying we can't do that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't move to stand in solidarity, especially as any of our territories are under attack. But I think in the larger goal, the bigger goal has to be for us to get our minds back together. And again, every once in a while, somebody will throw some crazy idea out there like, oh yeah, we got to go back to calling ourselves Indians because that's what they called us in treaties. Jeez, it does. It just absolutely makes me shake my head sometimes because these are the things that can be disruptive. We grab on, we embrace things. Like one of the things that I talked about on previous shows is somebody grabbed onto this idea that the word Indian came from Columbus saying in Spanish or Italian or something that we were like gods, that it was in Dios, which that doesn't even translate properly. But and they're trying to say, well, India didn't exist as a country back in 1492, so they couldn't have called us Indians based on that. And of course, all of that is wrong. I mean, India may not have been a country, but the idea of the Indies, the islands in the South, in Southeast Asia, and the area that Europeans were referring to India, not as a country, but as an area. It was just past the Indus River. So, I mean, again, we grab onto these things and then we embrace them. The next thing you know, we're trying to proudly carry this name Indians because we just tried to say it means something else. No, it was a misnomer from the start, and we didn't call ourselves that. Even if you're gonna buy into this bullshit that Columbus thought we had the bodies of gods or something, which is kind of absurd. Why would that label stick? And yet here we are today. We're still going to debate because it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's because Indians is mentioned 3 times in the U.S. Constitution. It's the Indian Act in Canada. Look, I don't care how many times they've used that word. It doesn't have to apply to us. We have to bring our minds together, and we have to understand. We first off, we got to identify each other. I mean, everybody talks about recognition. Federal recognition, Canada trying to manipulate, who we are by going. They want to say, well, we don't have to recognize matrilineal stuff in Canada, so we can take a woman off of any trust responsibility that Canada has towards Native people if she marries out. I mean, we actually conform to these imposed ideas, but this is where it comes down to. We've got to eliminate this notion that blood quantum, whatever the hell that is, it determines somebody's nativeness. I mean, I understand that living in a Native community is something that we have to put more of a priority to. And I'm not saying that if you leave the territory that you have to necessarily, abandon your identity. But I mean, because I would argue that these lines drawn in the sand by, again, by white people doesn't determine where our territories stop and start. But to be participants in who we are as a people, that's something we have to encourage. And if you haven't heard from somebody in 30 years because they left and never came back, I'm sorry, they are not part of your community anymore. And that was the choice that they made. And this isn't about banishment. This isn't about taking somebody off the rolls or disenrollment or any of that. I mean, it's about just seeing what somebody's activity is. But we also have to understand that in order for us to be successful as individuals, if we pursue that success away from our people, then we aren't doing anything for our people. We're just being selfish. We're looking for our own interest alone. We are pursuing our happiness at wherever and abandoning our own people. And look, that's what they did, right? That's how Europeans came here. They left not only their homelands, but they left their families. All of that immigrant population that came to our shores from Europe. Think about how much of their family left behind. They weren't even like the people in Asia who create this solid pipeline to bring in more and more of their relatives. Look, they abandoned their families. I mean, and that's what they did. They abandoned their language. I mean, how many Italian Americans still speak Italian? I mean, honestly. I mean, and then we get into this debate over Latina and Latinx and Hispanics, and we seem to lose our minds over the idea that there are brown people who speak Spanish, like somehow they were assimilated into Spanish culture. Well, what the hell language are we speaking? It's not exactly Doña Gueja. I mean, we've all been affected by this, but we have a hard time bringing ourselves together. And look, language can be a barrier. English, Spanish, and even as we have a resurgence in our own languages, we still have to accommodate the fact that our languages vary. So whether we're translating from again Mohawk to English, or Mohawk to Ojibwe or whatever else, we still have to concentrate on our abilities to communicate. So when you understand that so much of our original languages are about creating images, and much of it is metaphor, right? I mean, much of what when we describe something. And that's why, for instance, a simple thing, the words that we use for colors oftentimes are so close to a specific thing in nature. Like the word for green is almost the same as the word for grass. The word that we have for red is almost the same as the word that we have for blood. The word that we have for yellow is almost the same as the word that we have for an egg yolk. I mean, so it's because we use the actual physical object to describe other things. I mean, so if we're going to talk about the colors of a sunset, every one of those colors that we describe, we're going to say where in nature that color comes from. So it's all metaphor. So as we delve into English or Spanish or any of our indigenous languages, what we've got to do is have some cooperations and some collaboration on the metaphors. This isn't even tough stuff. Most linguists would have no problem with this. But again, we've lost our ability to communicate properly. And I got to tell you, the digital age isn't helping much either. Now we're using, we're making up words for texting, and we're really butchering the language in terms of, even the English language and grammar and punctuation and all that stuff. So if anything, it becomes more of a challenge. We've got to get back to understanding how where the metaphors are, why, how the description, the descriptive parts of our language, and how they, collaborate with other languages. That's where it's going to bind us together. I know this is a little bit of a departure, but we oftentimes hear so much of an emphasis on language, and as I said, when I hear people say the problem, the problems that we have with the loss of culture and language or lands and stuff like that, that it's all tied to language. If we want to be accurate about history, we're going to find out that some of the things that came into our territories came in when our language was fully intact. Everything from removing us, religion came in, residential schools, changing our systems of governance from traditional forms of governance that were tied to, our collaboration with nature and clans and that kind of stuff. The idea that we adopted these written constitutions. Half the people, when the Seneca Nation adopted a written constitution, most of the people in Seneca Nation still spoke Seneca. It wasn't drafted in Seneca. It was drafted in English. Why? Because white people did it. So I mean, when I think about these things, I think it's really, really important that people understand that to understand who we are, we not only need to speak the language, which I think is important, but we better delve into it more thoroughly than that. Like I said, I remember sitting in with a session where they were talking about, well, how do you say the times of the day? And this long drawn out word, especially in Seneca, was not about 3:15 or 3:15. It wasn't about saying the numbers in Seneca. It was about counting the tolls of a church bell. So again, we've incorporated this idea of a church bell or a town bell or whatever into our language so much that's how we were teaching our children. This is how you say, 3:00. And it's like, no, that's already bastardized our language by incorporating this idea of a tolling bell. Again, I'm not criticizing. If you still use that, then that's fine. But we should understand why. I mean, I've listened to people talk about ceremonies that involve ringing a bell or shooting a gun. Well, if we're firing off a firearm, then that's obviously not our ancient traditional practice. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with updating and modernizing some aspects of our life. I mean, look, I think it's fine to dig a grave with a little excavator. I think it's fine to use machinery to do that. I don't have a problem, getting out a shovel too. But when I hear people say, well, according to our tradition, it's got to be dug, the grave has to be hand dug. I said, wait a second, we didn't even have shovels before white people came here. So, I mean, again, we almost reinvent or fabricate this idea of what is tradition. And most of what we're calling tradition today is only what we've adopted as tradition since white people showed up. I'm not trying to put anything down here. I'm just trying to speak some truth about this stuff, right? So I think that that's what's important. Look, I'm one that, look, I wear the unity crest or the warrior crest on my shirt or on my hat or a flag. Flags weren't our things either. So that's one of those things that we incorporated. And again, I remember sitting with Louis Hall, and he said, we have to have a way to demonstrate and display who we are in the world around us. And his whole idea of creating the flag, the unity flag, was something that all Native people could identify with. And look, it's worked. There's no image that is more iconic or a more iconic symbol of unity and resistance than what people called the warrior flag, which originally was created as the unity flag. So we have created some things, that has changed over time. Again, we wear jeans and t-shirts and hats, ball caps, even though we don't play ball necessarily. So, I mean, but when I hear people say, well, that's assimilation. No, it isn't. Assimilation is not just about, what we do that other people do. Assimilation is about identity, and it's about who you are and how you define yourself. So, and when I hear people say stuff like that, well, we're not really sovereign because we get federal funding. Well, again, I always go to the same example. Nobody argues whether Israel is a sovereign state, and yet billions of dollars go to Israel, flow from the United States to Israel. Not just from the government, but billions of dollars come from Jewish Americans who send money to Israel. So when I hear people make a statement like that, look, there is a debt that is owed. And that debt is based not only on treaties, but on the transactions that those treaties were supposed to represent. There is an obligation that the United States has, and there's a debt that will never be fully paid by the United States and Canada to Native people. They built countries on our land, for crying out loud. So, of course, there's a debt to be paid. Now, will that debt ever get paid? Probably not. But when we talk about reparations, and I one of my quotes is that I'm less concerned about reparations from the past than I am about preparations for the future. And I agree with that. I mean that when I say that. Of course I agree with it. I said it. But I mean that when I say that. And I'm not saying that there aren't reparations due. Whether it's, comes out of some Truth and Reconciliation Commission associated with residential schools or missing and murdered Indigenous women, which oftentimes are going to fall way short. Or whether it's an honest assessment. I mean, look, we know that the court systems are never going to deliver justice to our people. We've seen that in land transactions. The liberal darling of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, made one of the most racist and right-wing rulings and opinions written in the city of Sherrill versus Oneida, where she used all of the same talking points that Scalia and others on the right side would use. I mean, things like, oh, you waited too long, latches, you were too quiet for too long, acquiescence. It's impossible, the doctrine of impossibility. You can't ever assert jurisdictional control over lands that you once owned or occupied, but lost control of. And of course, none of that stuff is true, and it's all BS that they made up so they could justify their existence. They could justify our diminished existence. And again, all of it is geared towards the one objective, what Thomas Jefferson called the final consolidation, to make us no longer exist as a distinct people. That is the definition of genocide. The scariest part and the most worrisome part is when we play a role in that, when we become the agents of our own oppression, when we volunteer ourselves to be assimilated. When I see somebody post on social media that we can no longer claim to be our own people, our own distinct people, because, like it or not, they've turned us into U.S. citizens. I mean, oh, cripe. Don't you understand what you just said? And how complicit you have become in their racism? And that's what it is. I mean, when the idea that any of us would believe that we no longer have a choice in who we are is an absurd proposition. That we have to conform to words that they wrote on a paper? We have to call ourselves Indians again? I mean, it's absurd that any of our people will go down that path. And they think they're being like legal scholars. Well, if we don't, maintain that identification of who we are, then we are no longer entitled to be parties of our treaties. Jeez. I mean, when I hear people say that, and look, if I offend somebody on social media because of what I'm saying here, then damn it, think about what the hell you're talking about. Especially before you throw it out into the world and then get, however many likes or approvals to your bullshit comments. We have to chart our path forward, regardless of what happens in a U.S. election or a Canadian election or a court ruling. Look, when I hear somebody say, like it or not, we're under U.S. jurisdiction, I know, because I personally have made this argument in my own legal proceedings, that our view is that we are not under state or federal jurisdiction. We make that argument, and do we win with that argument? No. And you know why? Because their courts can't deal with something that's outside of their jurisdiction. So they want to force us as round pegs through their square holes. That's what their idea is. That's what their strategy is. And this is part of the reason that I try and suggest that we avoid their court system at all costs anyway. And look, is there a higher power? Are there international courts? What about the UN? No, most of those things are inept. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a dialogue with the international community over some of these issues. Look, I applaud what my friends from the Kingdom of Hawaii are doing. The fact that they are using the international community to show the hypocrisy of the illegal occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the toppling, the coup that they endured. But we aren't doing that. We aren't doing that enough. And as much as the Hawaiian Kingdom, when it became consolidated in the way that it was, did emulate the British crown, so to speak, and of course it's even on their flag. I mean, even though it does that, they are still trying to move towards what they were when they became the Hawaiian Kingdom. We aren't. We aren't trying to move back to what we were before we were inundated with white people. We're trying to find some sort of peaceful halfway in between. We're going to adopt some of these Christian concepts into our ceremonies, and we're going to adopt. We're using their language, and we're trying to use their language in a way that hamstrings us even more, because we're saying that if we're going to use your language, we have to use the original words you called us. So, again, I think part of what I wanted to accomplish today with this program is to say, look, there's a lot of stuff that's out there that are affecting our lives, including American and Canadian politics and American and Canadian court systems. And while we have to be cognizant of what's going on there, including what's happening with a global pandemic, we shouldn't let any of those issues dictate who we are. We still have choice. And again, more than anything else, and there are some things that we may not have all choices for. But damn it, what we call ourselves is one of them. And what we are going to promote into the future is our choice. We don't have to accept this notion that we ultimately have to be absorbed by a larger population around us. No, we don't have to accept that. So again, as we go forward, let's not get obsessed with what they do and what they are. Let's give some concentration onto what we do and who we are. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.